Day 7 of the Cairns Cup saw tons of blood spilled over the board as the two former women's world champions Zhongyi and Alexandra Kosteniuk both won their games, establishing themselves as the clear forerunners with 2 rounds left to play. Jumping into today's results, Zhongyi won her 3rd game of the tournament, defeating Elisabeth Paehtz to move to 5 out of 7 and hold on to the clear lead. Meanwhile, Kosteniuk survived a dangerous position against Zatonskih to win as well, keeping pace as she remains a half point behind. Also winning their games were Mariya Muzychuk, who defeated Alice Lee, and Dzagnidze, who pulled out a win against Irina Krush. So with 2 rounds to go, Zhongyi remains at the top with 5 out of 7, Kosteniuk a half point behind with 4.5, and Harika, Dzagnidze, and Mariya Muzychuk currently tied for 3rd place and a point behind first with 4 out of 7. Going into the games, we'll start with Zhongyi's win over Elisabeth Paehtz. This one started off as a symmetrical English, but quickly transposed back into a d4, d5 opening. This is a symmetrical Tarrasch position, a3, a6. White takes on c5, plays b4. This is all pretty classic stuff, but Paehtz does get in trouble here out of the opening after White's move queen to c2. She had already started spending some time here, and the normal way to proceed would be to take on c4. Normally you don't want to take without forcing White to move the bishop a 2nd time, but here after bishop takes c4, b5 for example, Black can get the bishop to b7, and things seem relatively okay. Instead, queen to b6 was played. Now bishop to e2. Here Black takes on c4. White could have played c5 as well with an advantage, but bishop e2 is simple. Takes. And at this point, Black really needed to just develop the light squared bishop, bishop to d7, for example, followed by rook fc8. White is already doing well as the bishop won't get to the long diagonal, but I think things are not yet that bad. Instead, we saw knight to g4. And the intention after knight a4, queen c7, and bishop d3 is to play f5. And this is where things really get worse here for Black, as this move does weaken the king side long term. White simply plays h3, kicks back the knight, castles, and at this point Black's position has several weaknesses. The pawn on e6 is quite weak, and the bishop on c8 of course is a very, very bad piece. So rook f d1, bishop d7, knight c5. At this point, the engines already think White's advantage here is decisive. Plus, at this point, Zhongyi did have an extra hour on the clock. So things looking very, very good for the former world champion. Now queen to b3, just increasing the pressure, hitting the e-pawn. Rook e8, knight to g5, hitting the pawn once again. This obliged Black to take on c5, giving up the dark squared bishop. But now White's position is once again just strategically dominant. So the game continues, knight f3, bishop d7, a4, and bishop a3. White starts pushing on the queen side. Now the big threat here, b5, very difficult to meet. Black tries knight e4, rook simply drops back. Rook e8, b5, knight a5. Now both queens are hanging, so White doesn't win material yet, but Tan simply drops back here with queen to a2, and after the rook trade and queen to d8, knight to e5, king to g8, the knight f7, check was threatened here, and after king g8, White won on the spot with bishop takes e4. Here Black resigned because after f takes e4, rook to d2 would pick up the bishop on d7. And yeah, here White finally wins material, though at this point White definitely had a big advantage in this game for some time. So very, very clean victory from Zhongyi, who remains in the clear lead. However, keeping pace was Kosteniuk, who managed to win this game against Zatonskih. This one was quite sharp for some time. It starts off as a quiet opening in the Slav, but quickly things do open up here as Zatonskih plays e4, trading off in the center. And actually White does get a pretty reasonable position here, queen to e2, h6, bishop h4, and now c5. Maybe not the best decision from Black. Something like bishop to e7, just breaking the pin would have been better. Because after queen e7, rook to d3, rook to d8, Black allows d5, and now things get very, very difficult as White has a lot of pressure along the e-file. Rook e8 played, queen to d1, now threatening to take on e6, going after the bishop. This forces Black to play e5, but now rook to e1, piling up on the pressure. Kosteniuk goes g5, and at this point, Zatonskih sacrifices the knight on g5. Definitely a very, very strong decision. So after takes, white gets 2 pawns for the piece, and a very clear plan of bringing the rook to h3, followed by trying to get the queen over to the king side and delivering mate to the black king. So here Kosteniuk starts to defend e4, queen to e5, but now f4. Can't take en passant because the queen on e5 would hang. Queen to f5, and now g4. Actually a very interesting move here from white. If knight takes g4, the idea is to play rook to g3. The engine gives f6 here, but anyways, after bishop to h4, white is going to be winning back their piece, and black's king definitely not very comfortable on the king side. So white would certainly be better here. Instead, we saw queen takes g4 check, but now rook to g3. This was Zatonskih's idea. Queen takes d1, and bishop takes f6, intermediate check. White wins back the piece before taking back the queen, and we end up in this endgame that is actually winning for white with best play, as black's king on h7 is in huge danger. Black played e3, and this is where Zatonskih misses quite a number of good opportunities. For example, rook to e1 would have been perfectly fine for white. If black takes this pawn on f4, white will have rook to g7 check, and after king to h6, king g2 for example, the king on h6 is still in big trouble. Also very strong was the absolute brilliant f5. Sacrificing the exchange, this one be very, very hard for a human to find over the board, but the point is that black's king ends up in a mating net because of the bishop and pawn on f5. So it's kind of surprising, but white is actually completely winning here. If e2, then just rook to e1, the next move is king to g2, and rook h1 mate is kind of an unstoppable threat. So for example, king h6, white can bring the king up. If black tries to escape, then king to f3, and once again rook h1 is coming, and black simply can't stop it, and white is winning the game. That would have been an absolute brilliant find. Instead, Zatonskih goes rook to f3, defending the pawn, but the problem is that this allows black's king to escape off of the h-file, and now the king gets very, very strong. Watch this king, king g6, bishop c3, and now king to f5, and the king is coming in to the e4 square and actually supporting this very, very strong e-pawn. Bishop e5 played. Anna should have played this one move earlier. She loses a tempo here, and this does make a huge difference. King to e4. Now at this point, white should have just sacrificed the exchange and maybe tried to hold on in this endgame, although black is definitely for choice here. Instead, we saw rook to f1, but now bishop takes e5. Kosteniuk goes into the rook and pawn endgame, which is completely winning for black because the e-pawn is super strong and the king is incredibly active here, and so black is actually just winning the game. Rook takes f7, e2, rook a1, king to e3 is just a matter of time before this pawn promotes, and Kosteniuk's technique here was absolutely excellent. Both rooks on the f-file, rook f1 check, takes. You couldn't take with the pawn here because of the pin, of course, so rook takes f1, and now the king gets out of the way. d7, the last chance for white to try and make a new queen, but black promotes first, has a mate threat as well with queen takes h4 as well as rook h1. Next move, so white cannot promote. Rook g3 check was tried, but now king to f4, and the game is over. If white promotes, queen takes g3 is going to be mate on the board. So with that, Zatonskih did resign this one. Kosteniuk winning an important game to remain just a half point behind the leader, Zhongyi. Next up, we have the game between Anna Muzychuk and Harika. Harika going into this round also being just a half point behind the leader. She would need to win this game in order to try and keep pace. But actually, she got in trouble here as black against Muzychuk, as Anna here does get a nice position out of the opening and eventually a very, very pleasant advantage in this endgame. So the players exchange bishops here, knight to f4, takes on b5, rook to d1. At this point, black is doing all right, but white certainly has the more comfortable position. Pawn on b5 is weak, pawn on c7 is weak, and white definitely has nice pressure with the pieces. f4 now, f5, and this compels Harika to give up the bishop on d5, but white takes knight to d8, now f6. Very, very nice move from Muzychuk here. The two rooks and bishop definitely stronger than black's pieces. With f6, white opens up all the files and diagonals. Now rook to h4, rook takes h7. There's no way black was going to defend this one with bishop c2 coming next. So c6, black looks for some counterplay in the center of the board, king to e7. But now white is doing really, really well in this endgame now. Rook to e1, bishop to e4, all the pieces very, very active. And here the h-pawn starts running. And Muzychuk came very, very close to winning this game. She now pushes g4, solidifying the bishop, getting ready for h6, king to d6, h6, knight to g5, and this was really the key moment in this game. At this point, white plays rook to d8, looking to win a tempo due to the attack on the pawn. King c7 was the answer, and now rook to g8. So white brings the rook to g8, looking for some kind of sacrifice. For example, after h7, rook takes g5, the pawn would be able to promote. However, or rook takes g5 first and then possibly h7. But black gets rook d2 in, and this makes a huge difference, as now knight to f3 check is a huge threat that actually allows black to draw the game via this mechanism. Knight h2, knight f3 check, and we get a perpetual. So going back, what white needed to play was rook to e2, just a calm prophylactic move, stopping black from getting this counterplay on the second rank. And here white is likely winning this endgame, as h7 is coming and black might have to give up the knight for the pawn. So rook to d8, Muzychuk does let it slip here. To rook d2, she pushes h7. Not a lot of time left on the clock for either player at this point. Knight f3 check, king f1, and the players did repeat moves here, and a draw was agreed. Of course, you can't take the rook because then white would make a new queen, and from white's point of view, king to h1 would run into mate with rook h2. So a draw absolutely forced. Next up, we have Mariya Muzychuk with white against Alice Lee. This one started off as a Queen's Gambit accepted, definitely very, very classical opening. And quickly the players actually got into an endgame here after trades on d4, takes on c6, black takes on d1, bishop takes c6. And this endgame seems to be just mildly unpleasant for black. White already has this nice structure f3, e4 that restricts the two minor pieces, bishop on c6, knight on f6. So e5, knight d7, and bishop g5 check. Now tried by Muzychuk. And at this point, Alice had to play king to e8. Not the most comfortable move to play because you're disconnecting your rooks, but black would be able to get h6 and challenge the bishop next. Instead, she goes f6, but now e takes f6, g takes f6, and rook to e1. Excellent find from Muzychuk, counterattacking and hitting the e6 pawn, which threatens not only to win the pawn, but also pick up the bishop on c6. So fantastic shot here, and now black gets into a ton of trouble. So she has to go e5, but bishop h4, and everything is just under huge pressure here. King to d8 was Alice's try, but rook takes e5, just another fantastic find by Muzychuk. Here the point is the pawn can't take, of course, because it's pinned. If knight takes rook, then bishop takes f6 check, and white is either winning the rook back for free or picking up the knight and then taking the rook. So if king d7, for example, white will give rook to d1 check, and this is a big problem for black. If king to c7, white takes the knight first, then takes the rook, and white ends up with two extra pawns in this endgame and a decisive advantage. So after rook takes e5, black's position is basically lost. Alice tried king to c7, but now rook to e6, and white is essentially just cleaning up here. It's an extra pawn and very, very active pieces, not to mention black's remaining pawns on the king side extremely weak here. So bishop d4, bishop to d5. At this point, white is just looking to trade some pieces off. Knight to d5, the second pawn falls, bishop takes f6, bishop takes, king to c7, bishop c3, and now it's just two pawns up for white, with a very, very strong rook and bishop as well. So knight c5, rook h6, Alice tries b4, looking for just any kind of counterplay on the first rank, but there really wasn't much to be found. White's king has enough squares, and after rook takes h7, the game was essentially over. It's four pawns now. Black wasn't able to create any counterplay and soon had to resign. Moving on to our final game, we have Krush white against Dzagnidze. This one started off as a Nimzo-Indian variation with e3. Black goes d5. A very, very classic structure once again. And in this one, Irina actually does get the initiative from the get-go with this plan queen to f3, putting pressure on d5. Here black plays c5, but now rook fd1, knight c6. And this move is a mistake because white can take on d5. After knight takes d5, knight takes d5, white has won a pawn. It's possible black's idea here was to go knight takes d4, looking to win the material back. But here white could go knight f6 check. There are other moves as well, but this one seems to be quite strong. After queen takes f6, queen takes b7. White has the two bishops. Material is equal, but white is definitely doing well here. So instead, Nana plays c takes d4, looking to win the pawn back this way. And here, Irina misses a big chance with her move queen to h3. She targets h7, but apparently queen f5 was much stronger, hitting the pawn from this angle. The point is after g6, which black kind of has to play. White will have knight f6 check. That's the idea behind putting the queen on f5. And after the king moves king to h8, we can't take the rook yet because the queen is hanging, but white can drop back with queen to f4, and it seems like white has a very, very strong attack in this position. There's ideas of queen to h4. If this pawn ever moves, then of course white's bishop is going to try to get to the diagonal, and yeah, black's king on h8, definitely very, very uncomfortable here, and it seems like white has a big attack. After queen h3, white definitely gets a comfortable position here with e4, but not quite as good as in the other line. Nevertheless, it does look good for Irina, who starts playing very, very nice moves here. Queen to g3, bishop to g5, going after the dark squares, rook e6, and now f4. And at this point, white again has a big, big advantage. Queen to d6 now. And here, nice resource was possible. Knight f6 check. If black doesn't take the knight, then of course it's a very, very strong piece. It's hitting h7, and queen h4 is coming as well. And after bishop takes f6, white can take. And after rook takes f6, the point is e5. And once white wins back the rook, white will be up the exchange with a decisive advantage. That wasn't found. Instead, queen h3 was played again here. Definitely still a good move, just activating the queen, rook e6, and now f5. But this gives black a chance to turn the tables around with rook takes e4. Very, very practical exchange sacrifice from Dzagnidze here. After bishop takes e4, rook takes e4. In fact, the engines don't even want to take. They prefer the move rook to f1, keeping white's powerful light square bishop. Of course, this is a very hard exchange not to take. And after takes, knight to c3. Nice move hitting the rook using the pin on the d file. Rook to e8. This position ends up being very, very difficult for white, as now black has quite good compensation thanks to the strong pawn on d4 and very powerful bishops on the two diagonals. So queen f3, and now g takes f5, and at this point black, starting to overtake the initiative, already has the advantage. Knight b5, queen to g6, bishop f4 was the continuation, but now rook to e4, black is just taking over here. Bishop to g3 played, and now knight e5. All of black's pieces getting into the attack. If bishop takes e5, black simply recaptures, and now the threats of rook to g4 as well as rook to e1 check are simply too strong. This happened in the game, but it would have been hard for white to leave the knight on e5. You can move the queen away, but then white is under heavy attack there as well. So takes, and now rook e1 check is a big problem. If white were to move the queen, for example, then rook to g4 is coming, g3, f4, and black's two bishops, the queen and rook, are just way too strong. White's king is getting opened up, and white is just completely lost here. So huge trouble for Irina at this point. She decides to play knight takes d4, looking to sacrifice some material in order to defend the attack, but it simply wasn't enough. Dzagnidze does go rook e1 check, winning the queen, and now bishop takes d4. First taking this one with check, of course, if bishop takes f3, white we take back with the knight, and then definitely be defending that position with two rooks against the queen. But here black gets an extra piece out of it. King h1, bishop takes f3, gf3, queen h5. Here Krush resigned as she's down two rooks against the queen and minor piece. White's king is weak, and yeah, black's position is of course completely winning. So that takes us into tomorrow's critical round 8, where we have Harika white against Han Zhongyi, Kosteniuk white against Anna Muzychuk, Nana Dzagnidze white against Paehtz, Krush white against Mariya Muzychuk, and Elisabeth white against Zatonskih. Should be a very, very interesting and dramatic round, and hopefully I'll see you back here for the recap. Until then, take care.